We've entered the 13th day since Japan's export curbs of high-tech materials against South Korea took effect, and Seoul-Tokyo tensions are showing no sign of abating. President Moon Jae-in has sent a grave warning to Japan, saying that these measures will backfire, eventually hurting Japanese firms, to which Tokyo's Chief Cabinet Secretary Yoshihide Suga said the measure will be imposed for national security reasons, not as retaliation. This while diplomatic and economic efforts continue to mitigate impact. Today, we go in depth on the issue with Dr. Jun-sok, professor of economics at the Catholic University of Korea. It's always good to have you with us.
Happy to be here.
So Japan has not given one single export approval to Korea-bound core semiconductor materials over the last 13 days. Now, the deadline for the approval is 90 days. Does this mean that Korean firms have to wait another 77 days to see if they can get the materials they need from Japan?
Probably. We've always known that their usual process takes about 90 days. And what we're very concerned about is whether they'll use the paperwork as an excuse to actually limit exports. When Japanese officials interview with Korean press, Japanese press, or Asian press, they imply that the actual amount of exports might be limited. On the other hand, when the same Japanese officials talk with the Western press, like the UK's Financial Times, they said they have no reason to limit exports to Korea. So we'll have to see during those 90 days which side of that story is actually true. If they process the paperwork without that many problems, then Korea will have some difficulty, but the worst may be mitigated. On the other hand, if they do use the paperwork as an excuse to limit exports, then that would cause a lot more problems, as well as Korea would have a fairly legitimate case that we can take to the WTO.
What are the chances of Japan not granting export approval at all, even after the 90-day period?
Well, frankly, we don't know yet. It depends basically on how much Japan is willing to scale up this issue. As I mentioned before, when they're talking to Western press, the American press or the British press, they seem to be saying, well, it's just an additional process that Korea has to go through. The actual amount of exports will not be cut or reduced. Whereas if they're talking with Asian press, then they're strongly implying that they're going to limit the exports. And frankly, we're getting very much mixed signals from Japan on this. So we'll just have to wait and see. And we need to remind them that this is not just a Korean-Japan problem. It could blow up to be a global problem, because so much of the world depends on the semiconductors that Korea produces.
Korean firms are now busy looking for alternatives that can replace materials from Japan. Samsung Electronics has reportedly obtained emergency three key materials, emergency supplies of those key three materials following Vice Chairman Lee Jae-young's visit to Japan. And SK Hynix is known to be testing homemade high-purity hydrogen fluoride. And also, the Korean government is making efforts to diversify its import channels that include Russia and Taiwan. How do you assess these ongoing efforts? Are they sufficient?
Well, they're necessary. I'm not sure if they'll be sufficient, especially for the short run. There has been some interviews with engineers who deal with these issues, and one quote that I keep hearing a lot is that the semiconductor production, especially for high quality, high memory semiconductors, need a very high purity chemicals. So this engineer said that, well, Korea or China can make the etching gas up to about 99.9 or 99.99% purity. But what they really need for the really high valued product is 99.999% purity. And right now, only Japan can produce that at a reasonable cost and reasonable supply. We'll need to find not only alternate sources, but sources that can give sufficient amount of purity. And even in addition to that, apparently a lot of the production process is specifically targeted to certain specialties in these gases. So if they find a new supplier, they need to not only test them, but fold them into the production process, and that may take 1 to 6 months. So even if they do find a supplier that can produce the sufficient purity of the gas, it'll take maybe 2 or 3 months for it to be folded into the production process. So in the long run, we probably need to get diverse sources for these chemicals, but in the short run, there's going to be some effect on production.
Sounds like a very complicated process that requires a lot of time. Now, Japan also said that it will likely exclude Korea from its white list of trading partners that are given export privileges. Japan plans to collect opinions until the end of this month and make a final decision by August whether to remove Korea from its white list. If Korea is indeed pulled out of the white list, what kind of impact are we expecting?
Okay, well, we need to look at the effect from getting out of the white list, and also what would happen if Japan used this as an excuse to reduce the actual amount of exports. But for now, let's take the optimistic point of view and say Japan does not reduce the exports themselves, but only require more paperwork. Now, as we've seen, it takes about 90 days for the process to get through. So what this means is, well, we talk about global value chains a lot, and that depends on just-in-time production. This is actually, ironically, from Japan's production methods, but the components and ingredients that are needed for the production process has to be there promptly at the time promised and at the amount and quality that the exporters have promised that they would deliver. Because the whole process depends on everything being there at the correct time, the 90-day delay that could take place, that reduces the Korean exporters' ability to promptly deliver those products on time. So that may affect Korea's involvement in the global supply chain process, even if Japan more or less promptly processed the paperwork. But this also affects Japan as well, because it's up to the Japanese exporters to also produce these chemicals and deliver it on time. And the fact that the Japanese government can interfere in the process like this also sort of lowers the credibility of whether the Japanese companies can deliver these products. So if Japan wants to use the national security explanation for reducing these type of adding these type of delays, then they would probably need to have a good justification on why they would put such delays on not only Korean firms, but also on their own firms. But right now, they don't seem to be coming up with very good justification for putting on the national security justification.
Now, Japan is citing the fact that Korea has not implemented catch-all restrictions on conventional weapons and the absence of bilateral consultations in recent months as grounds for pulling Korea out of its white list. Your thoughts on that? Okay,
well, catch-all list is even if perhaps the products are not on the control list, if they can be used to make conventional weapons or even nuclear or biological weapons, governments should control their exports. Now, Korea argues that we already have a catch-all mechanism in effect. Japan says that it doesn't exist or it's not good enough. I think Korea, actually is very good enough. And we're willing to go and prove it to UN or any other national organization. Problem is, Japan need not accept that. Whether catch-all mechanism is just working effectively or not, that interpretation is up to each government. So it might not be convincing enough for the Japanese government, but Korea at least is willing to show its process to the world and let them decide whether it's good enough or not. And United States, for example, has not mentioned any problems with Korea's catch-all mechanism. So I think Japan has a very weak case here. Now, no bilateral consultation on trade issues. I think Japan may have a slightly more justification for that one. Korea and Japan have not met for bilateral consultation on trade for about 3 years. But it also takes two sides to tango. Japan has not mentioned that many problems with having not having a bilateral consultation on trade before. So I don't know why they would particularly say that they want to have one now. So I think that one, since we did not have meetings for 3 years, maybe that one's a bit more justified, but I think the fault lies with both countries rather than just Korea. Now, if you're talking about bilateral consultation over reparations for Japanese forced labor during the first half of the 20th century, well, I think there's a problem there because Korea's position has always been that this is this is a Supreme Court's decision, and because Korea has a separation of powers between the judiciary and the executive, it doesn't really matter if they tried to meet with the executive branch because this was a decision by the judiciary branch, which executive branch does not have any control over. But Korean government perhaps did not emphasize this as much as it could to the Japanese public. So in the eyes of the Japanese public, it seems like Korean government is avoiding negotiations on this issue when Korean government really does not have the power to negotiate over this issue. So I think that contributed to Prime Minister Abe's propaganda opinion that Korea is reluctant and is not willing to negotiate. So that, I think, explains partially why the Japanese public have such a negative view on Korea's willingness to negotiate.
Now, the recent Seoul-Tokyo trade friction is shedding new light on bilateral trade between the two countries. And trade figures show Korea, the U.S., and Hong Kong are the three major trade surplus nations for Japan. And in fact, Korea has been posting trade deficit against Japan for nearly almost 5 decades now. Then doesn't this prove that it'll be a loss for Japan as well eventually?
Well, Korea has always run a trade deficit with Japan, and that's partially because Korea has lesser technology level than Japan, and it's so much easier to buy a lot of these high-tech intermediate parts from Japan rather than try to source it from Korea itself. Partially because we do not have enough technology, partially because we don't have a competitive advantage. It's almost similar to what's happening with Korea and China. Korea is exporting a lot of intermediate parts to China, and China uses that to produce goods of their own for export to domestic use. So in a sense, it will hurt Japan eventually. And I think a lot of Japanese firms do realize it. So they don't want this to blow up into a full trade war. But I think in a sense, Prime Minister Abe is ignoring their point of view and trying to push this trade restriction through.
What other options are there for Seoul to reduce dependency on Japanese imports, especially on the high-tech materials?
Well, that's going to be a very tough problem for Korea. One reason that we are so dependent on some Japanese products is because, well, their products are right now the best that the world market has to offer. They have a certain technology level as well as infrastructure and educational level, research level that really makes these chemicals or some other parts very competitive in the global market. If Korea wants to be on the same level, if Korea wants to source these chemicals domestically, then not only do we have to invest more in research and development, which will take months to years to try to get it through, but we will also have to fix things like domestic laws and regulations because, well, part of the reason why we don't make these etching gas in Korea is that the domestic environmental laws and regulations are so tough. Now, why are these regulations and laws so tough? Because, well, there actually was an accident about 10 years ago in Gumi where the hydrofluoric acid was loosed on the environment. 5 workers got killed. Thousands of people had to get their health checked. And because of that, the National Assembly strengthened the laws without really thinking too much about it. So that's partially why we have such tough laws to begin with. But also, there's now going to be a public sentiment against having these type of chemical factories in their neighborhood. So trying to convince those people are going to be very tough. And the reason for this accident to begin with was that the workers who were working there and the company which was running the factory did not really place enough attention on safety. They loosened the valves and they were not wearing safety uniforms that were regulated by law to begin with. So just strengthening the law would not have done any good at all to begin with. So in order for these materials to be made in Korea, we not only have to give them funding, support for research and development, and that will have to last years because, well, if these new companies come in to produce these chemicals, but if the current semiconductor producers go back to Japanese supply after the trade war is over, they're not going to be able to stay in the market. So we're going to have to give long-term assistance, but also we're going to have to change the legal regulatory environment as well as convince the people that these factories will be safe. That's a big structural problem that needs to be addressed. Korea has been ignoring that for too long.
All right, thank you, Dr. Yang, for your analysis tonight.
Thank you.
And that does it for this edition of News in Depth from all of us here at Arirang. Thank you for watching.